Thanks for having us tonight. It's a pleasure. I sit in the shadow of this the great thinker, and it's quite an honor, I have to say. And just to kind of outline, 18 months ago, Barack Obama stood before an audience in Cairo. Most of us should have probably watched it. I was standing in awe and watching the screen in the newsroom. As he stood up and declared, "I've come here to Cairo to seek a new beginning between the United States and Muslims around the world." It's the seminal speech, probably the most direct and personal ever made by a US president towards the Muslim world in general. And it's ultimately the backdrop of our conversation today. There should be copies of it floating around if you haven't actually seen the speech itself. And if you don't see it today, I do encourage you to view it. You can see it online at the White House website. I've seen it several times over and over again, and it's just a tremendous thing to see. Partly for the hope that it brings, and partly to give us a sense of where we've come or haven't. He spoke of a relationship with the region, quote, based on mutual interest and mutual respect, based upon the truth that America and Islam are not exclusive and need not be in competition. And most important, that Islam and the West, quote, overlap and share common principles of justice and progress, tolerance and the dignity of all human beings. Mr. Obama ambitiously set off to tackle the Israeli-Palestinian issue, Iraq, Afghanistan, and Iran, speaking in a different tone than we'd heard for at least the past 8 years, if not more, and at least signaling a different direction. But it's been a year and a half since Cairo. The excitement has worn off, reality's set in, and of course there have been numerous setbacks on the way. So my question to you, James, is what have we learned about Obama, about the world he leads in, and what is the most important thing he has accomplished with respect to this region?
Well, thanks, Hassan, and thanks all of you for coming. And before I answer, I just want to say this is now my 10th trip to Abu Dhabi in calendar year 2010, my last one for this year. And it's been, for me, a great experience, and I really look forward to coming back again next year. So as for your question, if you ask what has been the principal accomplishment that's come out of this quite impressive and ambitious statement that you very aptly excerpted, I think you have to think in two separate terms. Tone, as you said, he wanted to change the tone, and substance. Now, Obama believed very deeply that the tone which George Bush had taken towards the world, and above all towards the Islamic world, had been tremendously harmful. That the United States, which had a great deal of business, it wanted to transact in the Middle East, and I don't mean that in the financial sense, I mean that in the most fundamental national interest sense, had been unable to do so because it was so widely feared and disliked and distrusted. And so Obama's view, and it was a view he had before he ever became president, was first, we have to change the tone. And it's very striking that even before he came to Cairo and gave the speech, which was in June of 2009, his first day in office, who did he telephone first? It wasn't the presidents of France, Germany, and England. It was President Mubarak, King Abdullah, and the Palestinians. The first interview he gave was to Al Arabiya, not to the New York Times or the Washington Post. So he was trying to make a series of gestures to say the Middle East is important to us, not simply as an object to act on, but as a partner. And we use these words, the Islamic world and the Middle East, a little bit interchangeably, but really the focus of the Cairo speech was the Middle East. So, as Hassan said, there was this note of mutuality which the president was seeking to strike in that speech. And there's a sense of mutual acknowledgement which lies at the core of that speech and inheres in its most eloquent elements, where he basically says the United States must fully acknowledge the role of Islam, the dignity of Islam, the historical importance of Islam, while at the same time the Islamic world has to accept the United States and not simply demonize the United States. It's somewhat similar to the way he dealt with the Israel-Palestine question by saying that Palestinians must accept the legitimacy of Israel and its right to exist. Israelis must acknowledge the sufferings that the Palestinians have had in seeking a state of their own and the legitimacy of that aspiration. So that was the central theme of the speech. And so if you say, did he succeed in altering that tone, creating a new language, a new emblem for the United States, the answer is yes. But the next question has to be, how important is that? Was he right in thinking that the central problem, or at least the most important problem, between the United States and the Middle East was this failure of mutuality? I think maybe not. I think it does matter. People respond a great deal to tone of voice. People wish to be fully recognized and acknowledged. And it's not surprising that, in fact, the speech resulted in big increases in the popularity of the United States and of Obama himself across the Middle East. But it's also not that surprising that those numbers have since gone down. And so that obviously goes to the question of substance. And it turns out that this change in tone, this act of recognition and dignity, doesn't get you all that far on the most difficult questions. And so if you look at those issues, Iraq, Iran, Israel-Palestine, the democratization of autocratic Middle Eastern countries, I would say Obama's made a lot less progress than he had hoped. Probably among those, the one where he's made the most progress, I guess, is Iraq. But it's a kind of subtractive progress.
Indeed.
That is, Iraq was a deep irritant, remains, well, I shouldn't really say remains, was a deep irritant. America's presence there, the regime change, the whole war, everything was a huge irritant in the Middle East. The reduction of the American presence there, as Obama had promised, removes that irritant. Now, of course, that's a long way from saying that he has been able to succeed in making Iraq a better governed, more humane, more democratic place. But maybe it's more fair to say he has discovered how extremely difficult it is for the United States, with whatever levers it has, to make those kinds of changes inside countries in the Middle East.
Well, this is the question. Did he basically set himself up? Let's take the issue of democracy, for example. The Bush administration was quite vocal and quite aggressive, actually, in pushing for a democracy agenda. Now, from the region here, we saw what the effects were of that. On one side, you saw a lot of activists, a lot of people who were reformers and that sort of thing, be emboldened, stick their necks out, in so many words, and feeling that, for once, something dramatic is happening. And by the end of the Bush administration, it was all over. And many of those heads have basically been cut. They've either been sent to prison, in Egypt specifically, and places like that, or they've been left despondent. Isn't there an inherent tension for Obama in showing respect to Arab regimes and for its citizens in a region where, in many ways, the citizens often feel so disconnected from their governments?
So I think this is a huge problem, but actually I would give Obama much higher marks on this than Bush for the reasons, Hassan, that you mentioned. Professor Lewis talked about the fact that Obama has not been the transformational figure people hoped he would. But in a way, the transformational figure of recent years has been George Bush. And it's a transformation not many people welcomed. And so when Bush said, famously in his second inaugural speech, but in other speeches as well, that the goal for the United States was to bring liberty, that was the word he always used, liberty or freedom, to the Middle East. It sounded extremely noble, and it did indeed inspire people here. And in Cairo, in fact, Condoleezza Rice, then the Secretary of State in 2005, gave an extraordinary speech in which she said something that no American leader had ever said before. She said, it is unacceptable to have a complete failure of rule of law in Egypt. It is unacceptable to not have free elections in Egypt. And it was quite impressive. But as you said, Hassan, what lay behind it? What calculation was there of the United States' capacity and willingness to force change, in this case, on a strong ally, Egypt? And so there was a moment of tremendous hope and excitement, and then there was the elections in Egypt. This is 2005, in fact, were the opposite of free. They were quite brutally suppressed. The United States said nothing. Why? Because they didn't wish to offend Egypt, their ally. And so this whole democracy agenda, which Bush had, which I also wrote a book about, and I believe strongly that it is in the United States' interest to be able to promote democratic reform abroad, in the Middle East and elsewhere. And I think it is possible to do, though with much more modesty, I think, more persistence and more modesty than we got from George Bush. So when Obama became president, one of the things he inherited was not only this deep sense of embitterment as a result chiefly of Iraq, but then also of torture, Guantanamo, and so forth. He also inherited this sense of hollow idealism. That Bush spoke these magnificent words, but what was really behind it? So, how has Obama tried to handle this issue? His view, which he had said to me and when I spoke to him several years ago, and he's repeated often enough, is that to talk about democracy without talking about rule of law, without talking about social justice, without talking about economic development, is not meaningful. And so for the United States simply to say, you must have a free election, or simply to use the language of democracy, no matter how ringingly, how grandly, is inadequate. I think he also feels that Bush's expectations were absurd. And you look at Iraq as the classic case that Bush really thought that by the United States getting rid of Saddam Hussein, the vacuum that was formed would be filled with democratic governance. And that was a fantasy. And so Obama has clearly retreated from that and spoken, I think, a more restrained language, a more cautious language. Now, it's worth noting that in the face of the recent elections in Egypt again, I was very worried, in fact, that the administration wouldn't say very much because these were even less free than the elections of 2005. But they did, thank God. They were quite critical. Now, is that going to change Egyptian behavior? I don't think so. I think in some ways Obama's democracy policy has been a little bit more striking outside of the Middle East. When on his recent trip to Asia, he went to India and said India should be a permanent member of the Security Council. What he was saying, in effect, is that as a democracy, as a solid, stable democracy, the United States feels enough trust in India that it is willing to place it in the most important position in world government. That's a different kind of democracy promotion. But to go back to the second part of it. Yes,
I want to just interrupt quickly here. Doesn't Obama basically benefit from the lessons learned from Iraq, that basically democracy is not just about going to the polls, but about building institutions, the institutions that were never built under occupation. And so inevitably, didn't he sort of benefit from the U.S. going through that whole experience, the neocons going through that whole experience and learning this is never going to work, and in fact their entire, the entire philosophy itself being thrown out the door? And does he bring anything new?
Well, first of all, learning from experience is a good thing. So if that's true, we're glad of that. And in fact, today in the class that I teach to the Sheikh Mohammed scholars, we were discussing exactly this question, Iraq, democracy, and so forth. And you ask, when Bush went into Iraq, did he not know this? Did he actually have good reason to believe that it would be possible to establish a democracy in relatively short order in Iraq? The answer is he may have believed it, but people who had knowledge and tried to tell him otherwise, people who had knowledge did try to tell him otherwise and were ignored. And so Bush was someone who only much too belatedly learned from painful experience. If you read his memoirs now he says, I wish I had realized that bringing democracy is also about institution building. He says this in regard to Afghanistan. And he regrets that he made so little effort to do that in Afghanistan, but plainly the same is true in Iraq. So yes, Obama and not only Obama, I think many of us have been chastened by the painful experience that the United States has had in the Middle East, and above all in Iraq and Afghanistan. And that chastening experience has led to the realization that there are very, very sharp limits on what the United States, for all of its power, can do inside countries. The United States has instruments or levers that are very powerful in effect on the outside of countries, in toppling a regime in Kabul or Baghdad. And that can easily lull you into thinking that it also has levers to operate inside of countries. Well, of course, the inside of countries, the culture of a place, is an extremely nuanced, delicate, fine thing, which you can smash. But to nurture it is something else altogether. And so, yes, I think Obama has recognized that that is, insofar as it's possible for the United States to do good in the world, and he certainly believes it is a longer, slower process which takes more modesty and more persistence.
And yet, in many ways, he's raised expectations. You know, I think that 18 months ago, I think there was a real expectation of something change, something dramatic changing, and seeing it palpably. The problem with it is, of course, it's not happened. In fact, quite the contrary. If anything, things seem to have moved back much further, especially on the issues of Israel, Palestinian Israel, and similar sorts of issues. Why has it been so difficult to make change on the foreign policy? And the main question is this: is it the problem of the policy itself, or is it a problem of being able to, for those policies to actually affect the change? And they're two different things, really.
Yeah, I think it is much more the problem of that on which the policy is being exercised. And so if you think, to go back to our last question, let's for a second separate out the issues that have to do with changing the external behavior of states, of which the classic example would be Iran, making Iran stop pursuing a nuclear weapons capacity. You separate that out from the things we were talking about before, changing the internal culture, the internal dynamic of states. I think there, Obama it's just turned out things are more intransigent than he thought. Now, but as for the rest of your question, why has there not been this big change that we were hoping for? Well, first you have to ask yourself, what exactly is it that people were hoping for? So, what is it people are hoping for? So what are the changes that lie at the heart of that Cairo speech? So people went away and they thought, oh my God, things are really going to be different now. Some of them have to do with America's own behavior towards itself. Remember, an important part of that speech was to say the United States will not engage in torture. The United States will no longer imprison people in Guantanamo. The United States will conduct itself according to international law. So how do we grade Obama on that? And I would say a more than passing grade, but far less than he thought. Guantanamo being the great example, and Guantanamo being an example more broadly of things that looked doable that turn out to be very, very hard. Now, Obama hasn't failed to close Guantanamo because he was lying when he said he wanted to do it. It's because it turned out that it was extremely difficult to figure out what to do with the people who would be taken out of Guantanamo. It's just a terribly difficult problem for which there is no easy solution. Mm-hmm. On the other hand, has the United States stopped torturing people? So far as we know, yes. If you look at the WikiLeaks cables, which maybe we'll talk about later, and you go through what's there during the period of the Obama administration, you don't find any revelations about illegal behavior or gross dishonesty or even gross hypocrisy during the period of the Obama administration. So in that sense, Obama's vow that the United States would behave with more regard for international law, I think that part is mostly, not wholly, mostly correct. But at the heart of this whole discussion is always going to be Israel-Palestine. Mm-hmm. I mean, that's the big question.
And that's one of the most important changes I see that came about, which is, from the very early days, you had this definition of the Israeli-Palestinian problem as a national security issue. I mean, that was quite unprecedented, actually. The idea of it as being a national security issue for the United States. What did that mean?
Well, so it's not as if this was a total revelation. I mean, I remember speaking to Karen Hughes, who was a very real intimate of Bush and became his head of public diplomacy. And though she never said this in public, and the Bush administration never said this in public, she said every time she came back from the Middle East, she would tell the president, we're never going to get anywhere in the Middle East if we can't do anything about Israel-Palestine, because people are consumed with that and enraged by that, and they see the condition of the Palestinians, and we have to do something. And nobody paid her any attention. And so this change, Hassan, that you've talked about, even if it may have been understood before, is in fact a genuine paradigmatic change, that we'll have to see what comes of it. The Bush paradigm for Israel-Palestine was the 9/11 paradigm. That is to say, for them, it was about terrorism. And you can see this in Bush's first speeches in 2002 about Israel, where he basically says, if the Palestinians will give up their bad leaders and repudiate terrorism, then we will find a way of recognizing a Palestinian state. He saw Israel as being a country in the same situation as the United States, as a victim of terrorism. And so it blinded him to the victimization and suffering of the Palestinians. You may even recall that when the Russians were committing terrible atrocities in Chechnya, Bush wouldn't criticize Putin because he saw Chechnya as yet another example of terrorism, and therefore saw Russia as a victim of terrorism. So that was the picture in his head. That's not the picture in Obama's head. It wasn't until, I think, probably this summer that it began to be said openly, first by General David Petraeus, then by Hillary Clinton, then by Obama, that the Israel-Palestine issue is a national security issue, which was simply a way of saying what was already clear, which is to say that the effect that the failure to resolve this issue has on the feelings of people throughout the Islamic world and the Middle East about the United States as Israel's chief backer is profoundly negative. It certainly is some part of the inspiration for jihadist terrorism, by no means the only one, but it is a part of that. So, having said that, that's a terribly important mental shift. But what does it mean in terms of policy? What does it mean? So now I think we really come to the heart of this whole question about the Cairo speech and this transformation and the deep sense of disappointment that people have. So clearly what it did was create a sense of urgency about trying to solve this problem, which you did not have in the Bush administration, where there was no serious attempt to grapple with this problem really until years into the administration, and even then half-hearted. This administration, unlike Bush, unlike Clinton, unlike any of his predecessors, tried immediately to solve the problem. And so the thing we all know about is the insistence that Israel frees the settlements. Now, whether or not that was the settlement freeze is the be-all or the end-all, the fact is that is what the Palestinians felt. That's what Obama's Palestinian interlocutors told him. And so his recognition of that was itself an important act of recognition. However, having said all of that, in effect, he threw down this challenge to the Israelis, and Israel said no. They agreed to a temporary and partial freeze, and now the United States has just suffered the humiliation of Israel saying, of trying to buy off Israel for the rather small achievement of a 90-day freeze with an enormous amount of military hardware, with the promise to defend Israel in the Security Council, and with the vow, I think never formally made but hoped for by Israel, that this would be the last settlement freeze attempted. So that now leaves Obama and the White House in a very bad place.
And not only that, but what's interesting about the past several years is that there's been the emergence, say, of space, of room between what we used to know as the Jewish lobby or the Israeli lobby and sort of the reality. You have organizations like J Street, lobbying organizations that take a different view from, say, AIPAC, the American
Political Action Committee, right? The American Israel
Public Action Committee. But just as important, you see more diversity of opinion.
Yeah.
And yet at the same time, he's not able to actually move that pendulum much.
Yeah.
Why?
Well, okay, so there's the American domestic political equation, and then there's the Israeli equation. Now, I think people here, and maybe people generally, have the misconception that this thing called the Jewish lobby is this overwhelming obstacle, which if it didn't exist, then American presidents would be much more free to do what they think. You're absolutely right that organizations like AIPAC are really, really powerful. But the reason that they're really, really powerful is that American public opinion broadly is extremely pro-Israel. And I would say for good reason. I mean, because Israel is a democratic country, Israel is a beleaguered country, there is a deep American sense of kinship with Israel. And the fact is, most American Jews are liberal. Most American Jews are not particularly preoccupied with Israel. And I would say that if you were to say what was the average American Jewish point of view on the conflict, it would be well to the left of the average American non-Jewish view on the conflict. And so yes, it's true there are these politically powerful organizations, but they wouldn't be powerful if that were not true of American public opinion broadly. So first of all, that is the case. Subset of that, the new election that the United States has just had, which has brought Republicans to power in the House of Representatives and, of course, closed the gap in the Senate, has brought a particularly pro-Israel group, of whom some are Jewish and some are not. So the new head of the House Foreign Affairs Committee, who is Cuban, is super pro-Israel.
That's Ileana Ross.
Ileana Ross-Latinen. Though the most important Republican voice on Israel is a guy named Eric Cantor, who's a congressman from Virginia, who recently said that American national security interests are synonymous with Israel's national security interests. And I write a column for a website called foreignpolicy.com, and I said, how can any country's national security interests be synonymous with the United States? That cannot be so, nor can it be so that Israel's are with the United States. That's a dangerous point of view. So yes, there is that domestic political constraint. But much more serious is the Israeli domestic political constraint. Right now, though if in polls, the majority of Israelis say they believe in a two-state solution, the fact is there's a profound sense right now in Israel that there's no meaningful possibility of that happening. And the current coalition government in Israel is unyielding. And so even Netanyahu, who is certainly very conservative on these issues and has been a terrible thorn in the side not only of, obviously, the Palestinians, but of Americans who have sought to create some kind of peace process, Netanyahu is by no means the most conservative member of his government, and he turns out not even to have enough negotiating room. So it is a problem on both sides.
And of course, what you now have is the sense that he sort of raised expectations, but was never going to be able to deliver. Did he not understand, or was it simply that much more difficult to solve?
No, there I think he made a miscalculation. I mean, I think, put yourself in his position. It's not an easy position. And so he's trying to think, what can I insist upon that Israel can do? Again, with the Palestinians, what can I require of them? And I think he thought, okay, settlement freeze, it's possible. He was wrong. So that leads to several alternative conclusions. Does that mean he should not have had any kind of preconditions? I think we now see that the talks were probably not going to lead to a good solution no matter what. And we now have a kind of circular problem. The Israelis feel profoundly beleaguered. I would say maybe right now in the short term, they have the complacency if things are okay. In the long term, they have deep existential dread that they're surrounded by countries and entities which seek their destruction. That in turn makes them behave in an intransigent way. That intransigence in turn jeopardizes the possibility for a meaningful peace process. And it is very hard to know how to break that cycle. I have some thoughts on it, but I can't say I'm very optimistic about my own thoughts.
I think there's a different campaign that's also begun on the other side, which is a sort of gradual murmur, shall we say, or discussion of declaring a state outright, unilaterally declaring a state, which increasingly is getting support. I mean, this past week we got you got the support of Argentina and Brazil, and a lot of the Latin American countries. They have large Palestinian population and such, and you see actually a completely different wind blowing from that direction as well. That just raises the stakes, actually, for the Obama administration, doesn't it? Because it doesn't have the control that it may have had over the process.
It certainly will if that starts spreading to European countries. I mean, I think it's obviously not a very good solution, because what are you recognizing? I mean, until there's an agreement on borders between Israel and Palestine, the entity you're recognizing is purely hypothetical. And unless you think that this act of recognition is going to pressure Israel into agreeing upon something which otherwise it won't agree on, well, then it's great for public relations. It embarrasses Israel. But if it doesn't get you to where you want to go, it's not very useful. My thought, not mine, I mean one that others have said that I think makes sense, although it's not a hopeful moment at all, would be something like this. So now that this whole thing has fallen apart, Secretary Clinton just said the other day...
And it's fallen apart, right? You feel it's done.
Well, let's put it this way. There was a momentum based on this idea of settlements, so that collapsed. So right now we're kind of nowhere. We're sort of dead in the water. And so the next phase, which Secretary Clinton announced the other day, is what are called parallel talks, which aren't even what are called proximity talks, are when this side is in that hotel, that side is in that hotel, and then someone is going back and forth between them. Parallel talks are when you're in Tel Aviv and you're in the Palestinian territories, and someone goes back and forth between them. So that's even sort of less urgent than proximity talks. But I don't see how that is going to get us where we want to go. An alternative thought would be something like this. The United States presents a hypothetical map. Okay, here's what it would look like. Here are the borders. Here is how you can create a coherent Palestinian state with sufficient security guarantees for Israel. Now, it might not go anywhere, but what might it do? It might provoke a political crisis on both sides. This would be my fantasy, in the following sense. In Israel, the many people who would like to, who recognize that there was no choice save a two-state solution, would say, okay, let's start from there. That then encounters tremendous political resistance, including inside Netanyahu's coalition. Maybe, somehow, possibly, maybe that causes the coalition, which is terribly fragile, to collapse. Because really, I think the only hope is for a different Israeli coalition, including the Kadima party, which is more sympathetic. On the Palestinian side, what you would hope that would do is that it would change the balance of power between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority.
Perhaps.
Right? So you would hope. I mean, maybe not. But you would hope that what it would do is that it would embolden, again, kind of symmetrically, it would embolden those in the Palestinian territories who do accept a two-state solution and would put pressure on Hamas, which doesn't. In any case, such a solution could only work, I think, if it alters the current political calculus, which I see right now on both sides as being hostile to a peaceful solution.
Now, I think, you know, in the discussion of sort of democratization and Obama's playbook, one of the things he did do that I found very interesting is right after the elections, where quite simply he resisted saying anything. He did what I think was very smart, was he basically told everybody to back off, let the demonstrations inside of Iran play out, and let's see where this goes. And yet still, again, you know, today Iran is still a central problem for the U.S. You know, we have new sanctions on Iran. Those sanctions, in addition to unilateral sanctions by the U.S., are even playing out here and having an impact on businesses in this country. And yet it's not working. Is that still a continuation of that miscalculation?
I mean, no, I actually think Obama's strategy in Iran has been about as good as it can be in what's kind of an impossible situation. I would give him more credit, actually, on Iran. I think on Iran, there are two obvious, appealing, but I think false alternatives. One, bomb them. This is the one that obviously Israel has been pushing and a lot of American conservatives have been pushing, because Iran with a nuclear weapon is an existential threat. And we now know from reading the WikiLeaks cables that this is not a view simply limited to those small groups, that in fact most states in this part of the world, in the Gulf, in the Middle East, have been saying quietly to American diplomats, we hope you will go ahead and do whatever it is that needs to be done to prevent Iran from gaining a nuclear capacity. We just don't want to be associated with it. We want to see it happen. And so that's been quite a fascinating revelation. So that's one choice, which I think would be a catastrophe, because first of all, it wouldn't succeed in really eliminating Iran's capacity to enrich nuclear weapons, nuclear fuel. And second, it would, the effects it would cause, both what Iran would then do, the rage it would cause, the way in which I think it would reinforce the Iranian regime, because they'd be seen as beleaguered, all that would be terrible. That's one pole. The other one is the opposite, which is to say, let us recognize that this whole policy of pressure has failed, sanctions have failed, and so forth. Let's just treat Iran like a normal country, and let us remove the pressure, in the hopes that doing so would bring Iran back into the circle of nations. So it's a little bit, in a way, a kind of recapitulation of what America was facing in the Cold War, which is what used to be called rollback, which is kind of attack the Soviets, on the other side, accommodation, or then in the middle, containment. Now, containment was always a policy that was easy to criticize. It seemed kind of too complicated and too weak, but the fact is it turned out to be the right thing. Obama is trying something like that in Iran.
You think he's trying containment?
Well, it's not, no, it's more of a metaphor. I mean, it's not containment in the sense that he would hardly say that an Iran with nuclear weapons is containable. It's rather that he's trying to find this middle course, which involves sufficiently intense pressure to change Iran's calculations, and I think beyond that, sufficiently deft diplomacy to peel away Iran's allies, and in that, we see from the WikiLeaks cables, and just generally from diplomacy, he has been quite successful, combined with offers of successful reintegration into the international community. Now, the problem with the policy is that it is quite possible that there is no disincentive and no incentive which will change Iran's calculations. That would be my guess. If that's the case, then we are faced with a containment question. It's not that Iran is going to get the bomb. Iran, at some point, we don't know exactly when, will master the capacity to enrich uranium to a high enough degree, up to 80% or more, where it can make the weapon, the fuel for a nuclear weapon if it wants to. That's going to be the critical moment. When it has that capacity, then the question will be containment or what? We're not there yet. But so again, a situation where there are no good choices, where I would say all things considered, Obama's doing the right thing.
Let me ask you a question that comes up a lot in this part of the world, which is the whole conflict over Iran and the tensions over Iran, is it part of a ruse also? Is it part of an Israeli game? Is it part of Israel trying to say, look over there, not at me?
No, though it is true that it obviously is an idée fixe, an obsession for Israel. But is it a ruse, as you said? No.
Maybe ruse is too much.
But is it a distraction from the reality? Is it not? Is something else the reality, and this the distraction from that reality? Well, again, I would say going back to those WikiLeaks cables, when you hear heads of state in this part of the world talking about their profound fear of what it would mean for Iran to have a nuclear capacity, then it is impossible to think that Israel, which would be so much more clearly menaced by that capacity than they are, that Israel is somehow trying to distract the world with these illusions. No, it's real. For Israel, it's an existential question. I think the only debatable question, well, there are a whole bunch of debatable questions. One is I think Israel has consistently put Iran's capacity greater than it is. There's been an ongoing debate between the intelligence agencies of Israel and the United States and others. Israel has been more forward on this, I think, because they're trying to argue we must act now.
Mm-hmm. I see. So this is the other question in discussing, for instance, the WikiLeaks, the sense that when Obama first came in, he pushed the idea of engagement with Iran. And that clearly freaked a lot of people out in this region, that maybe this was the end of the discussion. Maybe there's, in fact, a final deal. Did he learn anything by this? What is interesting is it seemed to be a prelude to actually him being able to take a more aggressive strategy, which he is doing now. Did his initial strategy of reaching out and extending a hand to Iran, was it part of a bigger plan to actually?
It's a really interesting question, which you hear both sides of, which is to say, when Obama said, "I am going to reach out to Iran," did he believe that by doing so, he could change the dynamic of the conversation? You might say, kind of analogously to what we've been saying about the Cairo speech itself, that the issue with Iran was that Iran felt profoundly disrespected, and a more respectful treatment would change the debate. I think the answer is no. And again, I think the answer is he hoped it would. He sincerely hoped it would. But did he believe it would? No. And so again, you look at the cables, and you see that early on in the administration, there was real concern in Europe that Obama didn't get it about Iran, that he was so naive that he thought if you say nice things to them, then they'll behave themselves. And so there was a very important meeting in March of 2009 between Obama's counterterrorism guy, or one of them, and 60 of his counterparts throughout Europe, in which, the cables tell us, he said to them, "Don't worry, we get it. We understand how intractable Iran is. We feel that the only way that we can put together a coalition to put real pressure on Iran is by demonstrating our bona fides." So if anything, the people who now criticize Obama on this are the people who believe that engagement really would work. And so those people say, you see, he didn't really mean it. He was offering the open hand, but it was all disingenuous. And I think the right answer is, sure, he hoped that would make a difference. He thought it was worth trying. But he didn't believe it would make a difference. I think he is certainly predisposed to believe that if you treat people with respect and dignity and so forth, that will make a difference. But he's not naive in that regard. I think if he did believe that about Iran, he would have been naive.
That's very interesting. And of course, WikiLeaks is a sort of common thread in so much of what we're discussing tonight. What has WikiLeaks changed? Has it changed the dynamic? And has it, is this a sort of the bookend where we started 18 months ago with a sort of a hopeful tone? There was optimism, there was, good intention. And do we now come to a stage where it's cynicism? Do we see a degree of cynicism in what was going on in the back?
Well, so I was on some TV show the other day, and the host said, "But is there anything good about WikiLeaks?" And I said, "Yeah, it's been great for me. I get to write about it all the time. I read all these cables. They're really interesting." There is a kind of school in the United States which says there's nothing new here. We've seen all this. We know what the policy was. It's just not really a revelation. But the fact is, leaving aside the question of whether it was right or wrong to have published these cables, they have been published. at least a tiny fraction of them, so we see them, they're there, and it's been fascinating. Certainly in terms of policy in this part of the world, it's been fascinating, and I can think of a couple levels on which that's true. One, this whole question of Iran, of all of these heads of state throughout the region begging the United States to solve the problem. Another, which I think we're only just beginning to recognize, this is something I've written about recently, American counterterrorism policies throughout the world, but especially in the Islamic world, require a lot of kind of subterranean presence. Mm-hmm. And that means sometimes aerial surveillance. And there have been different revelations about aerial surveillance in Lebanon, in Yemen, and perhaps elsewhere, not involving necessarily the kind of level of use of drones in killing in Pakistan, but like that, plus the presence of American special forces. So there is an element here of what you would otherwise call an infringement on sovereignty, to which sovereigns have readily agreed for their own interest or for whatever reasons. I do wonder what will be happening as knowledge of this becomes more broad, because either, at least in those countries where public opinion matters, publics will rise in outrage and not accept this, or sovereigns are going to have to find some way to explain this to people, to explain that this is not simply something we're letting the United States do because we're too weak to stop them, but because it's in our interest as well. So that's all been quite striking. And if this is a Pandora's box, it's only just starting to open. It's just a small fraction of the total. But I do want to say, Hassan, in terms of your point about cynicism, I don't think that what you feel when you read this stuff is that American diplomacy is a series of cynical transactions and secretive acts which are completely at variance with the public face of American diplomacy. I think it's more true in places where people are afraid to say in public what it is they're saying in private, which is, say, generally autocratic states. In the United States, there's more of a premium placed on transparency. And so generally what you find, whether you're reading about Russia and Georgia, or whether you're reading about the Middle East or Europe, is actually a pretty close correspondence between what the United States says as a matter of public policy and what its diplomats are saying privately. So it could be worse.
Well, what I think that's the most interesting thing I find in WikiLeaks, which is that, number one, so much of the reporting we've been reading has actually been quite accurate. Of course, the upshot of that is that it tells you how much of the reporting we've been reading has been based on the State Department and the leaks from the State Department, which is which says a lot about our journalism.
Well, yeah, that's how we make a living. Yeah, I suppose that's one way of looking at it. But it also, look, it could have been so much worse. And I think that if you had had the WikiLeaks cables in the let's say 60s or 70s, in the height of the Cold War, when targeted assassinations were not so uncommon, when I think the gap between what was publicly said and what was privately done was much greater, I think it would have been far more harmful to the conduct of American diplomacy. This is terribly harmful because people are going to be afraid to ever say anything in a cable. It's not harmful in the sense that it's exposed policies that are totally at variance with the expressed reality.
Mm-hmm. Jim, is Obama now in the sum total of all of this? Is he really weakened, or was this an inevitable course in his administration?
Well, he's really weakened. It wasn't inevitable. He is weakened. There's no question. I mean, he's weakened obviously domestically, especially. We don't know what this will lead to, but he's terribly weakened there. I think he's weakened abroad only in the sense that when you are seen as weaker, that then becomes a reality. Now, having said that, in the world of politics, especially American politics, which is so volatile, each of these moments of reality feels permanent when you encounter it. And then it turns out it's something completely different 6 months later. It's like having a little baby. When your little baby is 5 months old and crying all the time, you think, oh my God, this kid's going to be crying forever. And then when it's 10 months old, it's not crying all the time. What the reality is going to be in 6 months 12 months? I don't know. I would say probably 6 months it'll still be bad. In a year, if the economy is significantly better, if the Republicans significantly overreach, if Obama proves to be deft, we won't be having the same conversation that we're having today.
So you think there's going to be a second Obama administration?
If you asked me to bet, well, let's put it this way. If you had asked me to bet 3 months ago, I'd say easy bet, yes. Because I think the guy's got a lot of political skills, and because I think even people who detest his politics don't detest him, and so a shift in the political climate means they could come back to him. Today, I would still say likelier than not, but I say that mostly because the Republicans don't have an obvious alternative candidate. He will not be challenged internally by the Democrats. That would take a really shocking decline in his popularity. I don't think that's going to happen. And it's a long time. It's 2 years from now, so we don't know what Republican candidate could arise. But if you look at the current crop of candidates, I would say if the economy is felt to be improving, I would think that he would win. If it's not, all bets are off.
Spoken like a true journalist. Put your money down.
Yeah.
We don't have much time left, but I think we can take a few questions from the audience. We have one person over.
Also, please feel free to ask Hassan a question instead of me.
Ask him the hard ones.
Thanks very much. Just to mention about the substance and tone you mentioned, it reminded me of an analogy of a boy who went hunting birds on a tree. He started knocking off the birds from the tree, collecting them. Then he started to cut the onions, start to kill the birds, and there was a bird on the tree, and he was saying to his friend next door, "Oh, look at this boy, how nice he is. Look, he's crying." The other bird said, "Don't look at the tears, look at the actions here." Mm-hmm. That's the first comment I'd like to make. Second one, I remember Condoleezza Rice running around the Middle East, calling for democracy and freedom and making these speeches. But after the elections which were taking place in Lebanon, in Iraq, in Yemen, in Egypt, all the wrong political parties were actually winning. All the Muslim parties were winning there. So it quickly came to a stop, this call for freedom and democracy.
So can I ask for the question, actually?
Yeah. The question is, the reality is not about what is good for the Middle East. It is what is the interest for the Middle East? What's the interest for America? So when you discuss in this bubble here of Palestine, it doesn't relate to the thoughts and feelings of the Arab people within the Middle East. You're talking about a context created which basically aligned to the tin pot dictators and corrupt leaders in Egypt and the Palestinian Authority. Thank you.
Well, okay, I don't think that was a question, but insofar as it was a question, I personally would not want to have a president of the United States who said, my job is not to advance the interests of the United States, but to advance the interests of others against the interest of the United States. So to me, the central question is, how can one see the interests of the United States in a way that is aligned to the interests of others? So just to take one small element from what you said, the whole question of how the United States should feel about moderate Islamist parties that compete in elections and win elections is really important. And Bush, for example, condemned all Islamist parties. The Obama administration is very uncomfortable about this subject. I would urge it to be more supportive of some Islamist parties, at least those, for example, in Egypt, Jordan, Morocco. Obviously, Turkey is not a problem. So this is going to be an issue above all for the Middle East, but certainly also for American policy.
Way in the back.
Before I put the question myself, I'm a big fan of Obama. I'm not American, but if I have to vote, I'll definitely vote for him. My question to you is that this guy, to a lot of us, he comes as a person who has a very high level of integrity. This is how we look at him. And even on the economy side, even non-Americans can see very tangible results. In the last 2 years, as outsiders, we can see that, you know, things have improved significantly vis-a-vis what they were 2 years back. My question to you is that why do we not see that level of support for him? While there is improvement, in foreign policy, while as outsiders, there are a lot of people who see a ray of hope in Obama, why is that support not coming for him?
Well, you know, I still think if he were running for president of the planet Earth as opposed to the United States, he'd probably do really, really well. So I hear you in that regard. I think the answer is you don't want to become the president of the United States in the middle of the worst recession in 3/4 of a century. And so I think you're absolutely right that the policies that he adopted, which have been criticized from the left and from the right, have really, really mitigated the seriousness of a profound economic crisis which grips the United States and almost all of its Western allies. You don't get much political credit for making a really, really bad situation slightly less bad. Should he have adopted more drastic measures that might have had a bigger effect? I think probably yes. Was he too politically timid? Maybe yes also. He's a very cautious person. For all that he's caricatured on the right as being some kind of wild-eyed lefty, he never was and isn't. And in fact, is acutely aware of moving in small steps. And maybe even at a moment like this, when he needed to take a bigger step, he was a little too cautious about it.
And also, it seems he hasn't been able to articulate a lot of these good things he's brought on.
Yeah,
that's the thing that nobody seems to understand.
Yeah, you know, it's funny. Bill Clinton was so great at taking a really complicated issue and talking about it in a way that ordinary people felt it, without diminishing the complexity of the issue. George Bush could talk about it in the way that ordinary people felt it, but it felt fraudulent. Obama has a gift for doing justice to the complexity of a complex argument, but I think he doesn't have Clinton's gift for bringing it home to people. And I think part of the kind of cultural criticism of him in American terms, that he's an elitist, is in part because he lacks that gift that Clinton had.
The good old boy gift.
Yeah, the good old boy gift, yeah.
You've been raising your hand there. And then we'll move to this side of the room.
Well, first of all, thank you for this great discussion, but I've got a couple of questions, but first, before that, some background about what I'm going to say. This is just from the perspective of an observer. I have no stake in the outcome, obviously, but I'm just an objective observer. And
ask him that.
Oh, yeah. But as an observer, I do this little thing called thinking, and this little thing makes me don't get some points. First of all, like, I don't think we're discussing about, like, how the U.S. should try to establish some democracies in other countries. Like, I don't get why this is the U.S. business. I mean, look at the history. The countries who are now democratic countries, the change that allowed them to become democratic countries came from within the country, from revolutions, not from some outsider state trying to impose on them some kind of ideology. That's the first point. Second point, we talk about Israel, about Iran as being an existential threat. This is, of course, from Israel and the US perspective. But from other countries' perspective, Israel with a nuclear weapon is an existential threat. The US with a nuclear weapon is an existential threat. All of the countries with nuclear weapons are existential threat. So why does the US criticize a country which is trying to get precisely what the US and Israel has, and precisely what the US is funding Israel to get, and funded them to get? Because what do the nuclear weapons...
Okay, so let me answer those two questions.
Thank you.
The first one is, why is the United States trying to impose democracy in the world? And the answer is, it can't. And I think even George Bush knew that, though certainly the way he behaved would lead people to think that is what he thought. Actually, if you listen to what he said and Condoleezza Rice said, it sounded more reasonable, but their actions implied otherwise. Obama certainly doesn't think that. But if the question is, why is it in the interest of the United States, leaving aside what it can do, why is it in the interest of the United States? Again, interestingly, this is something I was talking about in class today. one of the lessons of 9/11 was that what happens in places very far away, what happens inside places very far away, can wind up having a terrible effect on the United States. That is to say, that there is a connection between a profound sense of embitterment and alienation people feel in dictatorial regimes and the creation of ideologies that ultimately lead to acts of terrorism. So it's in the interests of the United States, and it has been since long before terrorism. When Woodrow Wilson talked about making the world safe for democracy, that's what he meant. Now, just because a thing is in your interest doesn't mean you can do it. It means that you should try to find ways to do it. And that's what I was talking about earlier, the discovery that this thing is much harder to do than certainly Bush imagined it was. So it is a thing worth doing insofar as it is doable. Now, Iran. It is not true that states feel threatened by the United States' nuclear stockpile. It is not true that states feel threatened by Russia's nuclear stockpile, nor France's, nor Britain's, nor China's. They don't. There may be states that do feel threatened by Israel's nuclear stockpile, though again, it's something you don't hear. It is a thing that people say, it is a popular thing to say, it is an ideological thing to say. Certainly, there is good reason to fear North Korea having a nuclear capacity. I would say also there is good reason to fear Iran having a nuclear capacity. The question is not, does the nuclear weapon act by itself? It doesn't. It's an instrument in the hands of a regime. Now, having said all that, how do you get to a world where there is no nuclear threat? And I think the answer has to be that all countries, the countries that have it now, have to move towards nuclear disarmament. And I think you are right in the following sense. It becomes very difficult for the nuclear haves to argue not only that Iran shouldn't have that capacity, but that other countries shouldn't have that capacity because there are good guys we trust and bad guys we don't trust. That's not a lasting argument. And that is why Obama, something we haven't talked about, when he first came into office, has said his goal was to move towards the elimination of nuclear weapons. He's had a lot of trouble domestically because the American conservatives think that's wrong. He has made some important progress in that regard. Small progress, but positive.
Now, Jim, I just to butt in here, Israel has actually never acknowledged it has
Correct.
nuclear weapons.
Correct.
So what on earth is going to make them encourage them to give them up in the first
that's
place?
quite a ways down the road. I mean, I don't know, if the question is what's going to encourage anybody who has nuclear, what's going to encourage Pakistan to give up its nuclear weapons, or India? That's a long way down the road. I do think, though, that if there is any chance of getting there, you have to reverse the movement, first of the United States and Russia, towards growing nuclear stockpiles. And so this treaty, this START treaty, is a really tiny movement, but a positive movement in that direction. I think Obama is going to be blocked in his attempt to use that as the first step towards more serious nuclear disarmament.
Let me play devil's advocate. What did Pakistan gain by getting the bomb?
Oh, great. I mean, from Pakistan's point of view, they had all these wars with India, which they lost. Then they developed the bomb. Haven't had a war with India ever since. And so from their point of view, this was the ultimate equalizer. In the same way, I mean, oddly enough, after World War II, when Russia was left with a huge army and the United States essentially reduced its military to an almost skeletal force, the U.S. felt it could do that because it had the equalizer. And so the nuclear weapon, North Korea is the ultimate example. Its people are starving to death. It has nothing, but it has the nuclear weapon.
So that simply underscores the Iranian desire for it.
Yes, no, I don't question that. It's not that I think that it's shocking that they want that. I just think it's really dangerous that they want that.
Back there. To the other side. Okay, go ahead.
My name is Raymond Hampton, and I'd like to ask about economics and how important is that decision process that has to do, for instance, could Israel and Palestine justify peace if there's not going to be any economic benefit? For instance, Israel gets billions of bucks from the United States.
You know, some things respond to economic incentives and some don't. Some are just too deep for that. I mean, if you sort of take that thought experiment and say, because Israel would love to solve this problem by saying, we're going to help turn Palestine into a garden spot. We're just not going to let it be a state. And so let's say you could make that real. And you poured billions of dollars into the Palestinian territories, and you really made it prosperous. Do we think Palestinians are going to say, oh, in that case, I really don't care about having a state? No, no, it's primal. It's too fundamental. And so, you know, economics will get you to a lot of places, but with things that go to people's fundamental identity, it won't.
But it would keep young men from going to blow themselves up when they feel that they can build a career with
Oh,
it.
yeah, I'm all in favor. I mean, of course, and this is true, you know, the same is true in Iraq, the same is true in, you know, in all sorts of places. Poverty becomes one of the great motive forces for acts of terrorism and just acts of antisocial actions in general. It's just that I think it's an illusion to think that this is a problem that can be solved exclusively at the level of economics.
Though, I mean, to be fair, I mean, even in Iraq, we saw, for example, whenever the economy picked up, whenever people were put to work, the level of violence dropped.
Yeah.
That doesn't necessarily end the conflict,
Right.
but what it does is it ends the actual violence.
And there's a reciprocal relationship between the economic and the political thing. When you have a dysfunctional political system, it's very difficult to build a functioning economy.
Yeah.
But when you have a dysfunctional economy, it's very difficult to create political legitimacy. And there's a big kind of chicken and egg problem. I tend to think that it's the political thing that comes first. You have to build a at least modestly legitimate state before people start investing, before people make the psychological investment. In some ways, that's the problem in Afghanistan, that people have so little belief in even the most basic legitimacy of the state that when they're faced with a series of very painful, difficult choices with the state on one side and the Taliban on the other, for all that they hate the Taliban, they won't take the side of the state.
Back there.
Thank you very much for your talk. Just two questions, please. You talked about Obama and Bush, and it sounded like it is a one-man show. Is it so? And in relation to that, I read a few articles about a weak Obama, especially with the relations to James Jones and Mark Christo. What is your opinion on that? The second question, you talked about closing Guantanamo. Turned out to be difficult. Is it also this case for Afia Siddiqui, and why? Thank you.
Well, it's a good question. You're right. I mean, I've used these names in a way as a kind of shorthand. In the case of Bush, you can't understand Bush without understanding the people around him, because Bush himself had no real conception of the world. And so what he became after 9/11, that was just a statement of fact. I didn't even mean that as a criticism. You're right. I mean, it's kind of shocking. But he had never, this was a guy, I was saying this in class today. Think about this. Here's someone whose father, when he was growing up, was the ambassador to China. He was the head of the CIA. He was the UN ambassador. He went all over the world. So and this was obviously a very privileged young person. He went to Andover and Yale. So just think if that was your father. You would say, can I come with you? You'd go everywhere. This guy never went anywhere. He had no interest in going anywhere.
He went to Cancun.
Which is basically like saying he went to Miami, right? And presumably he went to pick up girls. So this is someone who had no interest in the world. And so the people who surrounded him, Rumsfeld, Cheney, Wolfowitz, Condoleezza Rice, are very important in understanding who he became. And in fact, today we were reading a book called The Rise of the Vulcans, which is the Vulcans is the name that Condoleezza Rice gave to the group around him. This is not true in Obama's case. The piece that I wrote about Obama was basically, does Obama have a worldview? And the answer was, he had a worldview. The people he chose don't even necessarily share that view. I mean, Obama's sense of himself was, to use Professor Lewis's word, transformational, though I think we've all agreed that he hasn't been so transformational so far. The people he surrounded himself with, Hillary Clinton, James Jones, and others, were not. They were much more traditional people. But in order to understand the choices Obama has made, you basically have to understand Obama. If you look, for example, at the choice he made in Afghanistan, He listened to everybody. He had endless discussions. But it really was his call. Even though Vice President Joe Biden's a very important figure for Obama, he is in no way comparable in that regard to the role that Dick Cheney played in the Bush administration.
I think we have time for 2 more questions. So I'll start there and then go back here.
Thank you, first of all, for the talk. I go to Sorbonne University in Abu Dhabi. Do you think Rahm Emanuel's resignation has anything to do or can tell us about where the Obama administration is heading in the Israel-Palestine conflict?
No, it really doesn't. I mean, Emanuel was, people mention his name in that context a lot because he briefly served, actually not really in the Israeli military. He had a kind of auxiliary role in the Israeli military. But the fact is, it's not as if there was he was some kind of internal super pro-Israel one-man lobby, because he pretty much shared Obama's view. I think, if anything, Obama may have relied on him for advice about Israel too much, because he probably thought that Emanuel knew more than he did. But no, I don't think it has any effect.
And then finally, let's take one student, and then we'll take the lady in the back. Go ahead.
So hello, my name is Harrison, and I've been a big fan of foreign policy in your column for quite a while now. I have a kind of specific question. We've been talking about WikiLeaks and the threat of the nuclear weapon, especially in Iran's hand. Is there any possible avenue where it would be a good scenario for the US, for Iran to have nuclear weapons, as in like maybe the Middle East would try to like come together against Iran, maybe under Turkey, and Turkey is a big ally of the States? Do you see where
I'm sorry, is the question, is there any
Is there any positive outcome
of the United States having nuclear weapons?
Of an Iranian bomb.
Of Iran.
Oh, of an Iranian bomb?
Yes.
Wow.
Hypothetically speaking,
No.
of course.
No, I can't. I don't think there's any positive outcome for any country, even a country who we don't feel nearly as nervous about as Iran, gaining a nuclear capacity. And if anything, it's kind of remarkable. If there had, you would have thought that there'd be 40 countries by now with a nuclear weapons capacity, because God knows the scientific and technological infrastructure exists to make it possible. The fact that there hasn't been is actually a kind of generally unnoticed success of the non-proliferation regime. But no, certainly Iran is the last country where you could imagine anything positive about their having a nuclear capacity.
But as powerful, as a bomb is, as powering, engendering as a bomb is, it's actually a stupid weapon. You can't actually use a nuclear weapon.
Doesn't mean it's not useful. But I mean, that's true, but it doesn't mean it's not useful.
So it's a political tool more than it is. It's not really a weapon. You can't use it as a weapon.
That's right. But I mean, you know, if you don't stop that, my big brother's going to beat you up, is also a certain kind of weapon. Now, you may have made up your big brother, but I mean, if people believe it, then, you know, they won't do whatever you say you're going to do. So yes, a nuclear weapon is a purely political commodity. It is a latent weapon, in effect.
And then last question. Back there, please.
Please, regarding Mr. Obama's foreign policy, what's about Europe and Russia? Does he consider them as real partners?
You know, you do hear this sense of, in Europe, of this is the first president who doesn't think of Europe as being the center of the map for him. And yet I was just reading something about Bush, where Europeans were saying of Bush, this is the first president who doesn't think that Europe is the center of the map for him. I mean, obviously, you know, it's hard to be Europe when you sort of feel like we used to be, you know, the world's darling, and now Asia's the world's darling. I would distinguish, well, a couple things just quickly. It is true that Obama is a kind of post-Cold War person generationally. And so the sense that the Atlantic Alliance, the alliance that stood together in World War II, is the heart of the world, is not necessarily intuitively true to him. So at some visceral level, maybe that's not so. I think, in some ways, Europe is difficult to deal with because it's only unified in theory, and so, you know, there's a million different meetings he has to go to, and if only, as Henry Kissinger once said, Europe had a phone number. You know, this is what Europe thinks. So, I mean, but no, I think those fears are exaggerated. Russia's terribly important to Obama. There's no question. And one thing I didn't mention, so I can end on a positive note, the reset with Russia, the premise of which was kind of like the reset with the Middle East. There are so many important things that the United States must be able to, that the United States cannot do without Russia, in terms of energy, in terms of Afghanistan, in terms of non-proliferation, in terms of Iran. He's succeeded insofar as he can. I mean, Obama has clearly put relations with Russia on a much better footing than they were when he came in. So if we talk about Obama's engagement policy, this is an example. I admit a modest one, but all such gains are modest. There are no radical gains in the world of foreign policy. Everything is incremental. This is a place where I would say his policy choices have turned out to be mostly successful.
Jim Traub, thank you for coming. It was a brilliant conversation.
Well, thanks very much. It was a pleasure.